sons, somehow people come up with 75. I haven't figured that out. But anyway, 70, 74, however you want to look at it, right? Because God has now brought his people, Israel now by name, through the patriarch of the family who's been renamed Israel, Jacob. They are now in Egypt. Okay? We'll talk in a minute about when I say God has now made this all happen, right? And as Genesis comes to a close, Jacob, Israel, dies. And Joseph calls his brothers to him. And what do his brothers do? They cower in fear. Why? Because they're still figuring Joseph's like them. And that Joseph put up with them, let him be there, etc., for the sake of his dad. And now that his dad's gone, they're toast. And Joseph says the most wonderful thing at the end in Genesis chapter 50, one of the most important passages of the Bible in my estimation, is when Joseph looks at his brothers and says, what you intended as evil, God intended as good. Right? Questions about all that, about those chapters, as you were going through them and reading them. By the way, I think this officially qualifies as an addiction. I am doing this class with 3 iPads. You think so? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's interesting that they point out that he was embalmed.
Yeah, what Karen said was it's interesting that it points out that Jacob was embalmed, okay? And I spent some time trying to do some research on that because we know the Jewish tradition now is still not to. They have a tradition, I'm going to call it, although they call it a rule, a law, that a Jewish person that passed away needs to be buried within 48 hours. And they do not embalm them, okay? And you hear Jewish people talk about embalming being a pagan thing. And so it struck me too when it made a point that Jacob was being embalmed. And the best that I could see anybody come up with, or the best I can come up with, and found 1 or 2 at least that agree, is in order for Jacob to be taken back up to Canaan, they really had no choice. Okay? Plus, if you notice, it says that he's embalmed. It takes 40 days to do the embalming. Okay? Because what they did was they removed all the organs from the body, and they would fill the cavity with salt and spices, and then wait for that to be absorbed, and then they'd fill it up again, and be absorbed and fill it up again. And then there was 30 days worth of time of grief that the whole nation participated in. And so this was also before they headed up to get him buried. So this was also, we can see the respect that Egypt had for Joseph and for his father. Notice when Jacob meets Pharaoh, who blesses whom? Or who? Jacob blesses Pharaoh. That's completely backwards. So there's a lot of respect being shown in all this toward Jacob because of Joseph. And remember, in a lot of ways, there's been times when Pharaoh and others have said, man, Joseph's God is something else, right? So I'm not saying they believe in God for their salvation, if you will, but there's a recognition that Joseph worships a God that's quite amazing. Karen, did you find anything?
Joseph was also involved.
Yeah, Joseph was also involved. Yeah. Yes?
I noticed, I don't know if it's in this chapter, but they switch in a sentence. Israel, Jacob, I think it's Jacob, back to Israel. They call them the same person by two different names.
It's because God renamed Abram to Abraham, God renamed Jacob to Israel.
They keep switching back and forth.
Because he's both. Don't try to read into that. Okay? They're not calling him Jacob when he's bad and Israel when he's good or anything like that. Okay? It's just like Simon is Simon sometimes and Peter other times. Paul is Saul until he gets named Paul, but then people still refer to him as Saul. So, yeah.
Does Israel have a meaning?
Yes. Oh, goodness gracious. Now I can't come up with it. And it's important at the end. Israel means he strives with God. Okay? And it's specifically pointing to him wrestling with God. Okay? Yeah. Yes?
There's chapter 49 where Jacob blesses his sons.
Yep. And switches his hands.
A lot of those things don't seem to be like blessings that he's passing on to some of his sons.
Well, remember there's a lot of different blessings. Okay? So two interesting things happen here when Jacob blesses Joseph's sons. First of all, in blessing Joseph's sons, he's giving Joseph really a double portion of the inheritance. Okay? Because now because if you read through all the blessings, Levi's got to feel really bad. I mean, Reuben shouldn't feel bad because you're a louse, so you don't get the blessing that God intended for his people. All the way down to Judah, that is the one who receives the blessing as the one that will carry on toward the Messiah, right? Levi gets no land. Everybody else is told, you're going to live by the sea, you're going to do this, you get the hill country, yada, yada, yada. Levi's going to get nothing. Why? They're the priests. Okay? So they're going to be provided for by everybody else. So if you take out Joseph for a second, take out Levi for a second, how many sons are receiving the blessing of the land, the inheritance? 10. How many clans or how many people groups in the promised land when they come to it? 12. Because Jacob now blesses Joseph's two sons. Each will have a portion of the inheritance themselves now. So Joseph, instead of getting a single portion of the inheritance, gets double. Okay? Why? Because he's the favorite. Okay, but it will come to be, will there be Manasseh Ephraim in the promised land will be one of the 12 tribes. Yeah.
So that's why he switched them, the younger.
Well, that's the other thing that happens. He switches them, okay? Probably the best we can do, because in switching them, you're right, when Jacob steals the inheritance, right, he does it by deceit. Now Jacob switches the inheritance with the two boys. The best we can come up with that is that's just simply pointing back to it's never, even in Joseph's case, God doesn't simply allow it to be the firstborn like everybody expects. He's constantly switching it up. And all along, right, Ishmael doesn't receive the blessing. Esau doesn't receive the blessing. And the older of the two, Joseph's two boys, doesn't receive the primary blessing. Okay? Now, there's also things in there about one of them is going to do good stuff and one of them is going to get absorbed into Judah and all. I mean, there's all that kind of stuff happening also, right? which we'll see as it all plays out. Okay? But remember that in that whole thing, that whole rundown of who's getting what, the important one is that Reuben and Dan are skipped, or Reuben and, no. Reuben and Simeon are skipped because, and Levi are skipped. Levi, for two reasons, are skipped because of how they've acted, and Judah is the one who receives the blessing of carrying on the promise of the Messiah. Okay.
They were pretty.
Huh?
Some of these were, when you're told some of this stuff,
Well, we read about all this stuff happening, right? I mean, it is Reuben, right? We're in chapter 49, verse 3. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. That's as the firstborn should be. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence because you went up to your father's bed. What does that mean? He slept with his father's wife, or a concubine, however you want to do it, Bilhah. That happened several chapters ago. It's one line, I can't even remember where it is, but it's one line that says, and Reuben slept with Jacob's concubine Bilhah.
And then it says, and Jacob knew.
Yeah,
Jacob knew.
yeah,
Doesn't say how he knows or anything, but he knew.
right. Simeon, Levi did a whole bunch of bad stuff with their swords when they enacted revenge for their sister. And again, Jacob knew it and didn't do anything about it. So cursed be their anger, right? Cursed be them. And then finally, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Good. Anything else about end of Genesis?
That's Joseph that had lived 110 years, and then, so.
Yep.
So.
And it's hard to know really how long after Jacob's death. I guess we can figure it out. I don't know if it says anywhere how old Jacob was when he, because remember he had his first bunch of kids and Rachel couldn't have any, and then finally she did. So I don't know how old Jacob was when Joseph was born, but Jacob dies at 147 and Joseph at 110. So
where I was going with that is that, so it's the children of Israel were in Egypt, were they enslaved for 400 years, or were they there for 400 years?
there for 400 years.
So
Roughly.
410
430, I think, is what they say, because you count 400 enslaved and, 30 by the time we know Joseph's gone. But those are rough numbers. We know the number 400 for sure because God said so. You're going to be in a land that you do not know, that's not your own for 400 years, and then I will bring you out. Okay?
Pastor, do Israelites today know which tribe they belong to, like we read in the Bible?
There's probably some that do. When they came back from Babylon, and they rediscovered the Word, God's Word, the Pentateuch, they realized that part of their problem and why they were taken off to Babylon is because they were worshiping other gods. And part of that worshiping other gods was they were intermarrying with the local people, other people. And they decided that the only way to really be true to God is to be pure Jewish. And so they went and identified everybody who came back from Babylon who were pure Jewish and what tribe they were from. And I'm sure there are some who have tried ever since then to maintain their understanding. But I couldn't tell you how many there really are anymore. Yeah.
My husband's family was Orthodox, and he knew that he was a Benjamin. My father's
Yeah, and then there's a whole bunch of things going on too, is that when the modern state of Israel was put together, the Jewish people went through and in a lot of cases assigned which tribe you were now from. So I'm still not sure anybody truly knows for sure whether they're pure blood from the tribe of so-and-so. Okay, good. Anything else? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I thought it was interesting that after all that happened, when their father died, Joseph's brothers still had to go by him and say, your dad said you need to forgive us. You know, it's like, oh my goodness.
And Joseph's like, relax, I got this, yeah. And think about it. A lot of times we ask, why do all these things happen, right? But in some cases we can say we absolutely don't know, right? Why did God send his people down to Egypt? To save them, right? Well, I can think of a whole bunch of other ways that he could have saved them, right? He could have planted a cloud right over that little part of Canaan and watered it regularly, right? And taken care of them that way. But he didn't. Why? I don't know.
Well, they still working for a horde of Jewish doctors and being involved in a lot of this hearing stuff. They still talk about our people were rescued.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute when we talk about it. Yeah, but why did God send them someplace where they had to be rescued in the first place?
Well, they like to talk about it.
Well, sure. We kind of talk about God a lot too. Yeah. But God could have done things a lot of different ways, right? Why did God end up with Joseph in Egypt?
It's part of his master plan.
Well, part of it is this is how he's going to get the whole salvation done. But if you notice, all through Genesis, things are constantly happening where God is, I'll use a word that I probably shouldn't, forcing his people to become dependent on him and not on themselves. Look at the transformation that happens with Joseph. From this egotistic, I'm better than you kid, to now this humble man who's running the world, by the way, right now, who is able to say, I know what you meant it for, but God meant it for something very different. And who am I to take the place of God?
By keeping them in Egypt and letting them stay in the land of Goshen, they were not mixing with local through marriage, for the most part.
Not through marriage.
Yeah, and it's a chance for a nation to grow and develop.
Yeah, it was. And we see that happening as we get into Exodus. We also know that really, really bad stuff happened in Egypt. So, not to them, that they did really, really bad stuff in Egypt. They lost completely the worship of God. Okay. But we'll get into that. Anything else about the end of Genesis? So let's flip then to our attention to the beginning of Exodus. So now we're here, okay? And we now jump ahead 400 years, okay? And what are the first words in Exodus? Besides the names, after the names, verse 8. Now there's a new king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. So after 400 years, we know we now have a Pharaoh who does not care who Joseph is. Does not care what he did. Does not care who Joseph's descendants are, except what has happened. There's a bunch of them. Enough that he's afraid that if an enemy attacks, he'll make these Israelites in Goshen, and now spread out elsewhere also, allies, and now they'll be battling within their own borders against an enemy that has become truly, truly formidable. Okay? And so what does he do? He tells, first of all, tells the two midwives, which there had to be more, but these must have been the head midwives, right? If it's a girl, let it live. If it's a boy, kill him. What do?
They lie.
They ignore him and they lie, kinda. Most would suggest that some would suggest that because they only named two midwives, they truly, really only were the two midwives, and every ladies had babies on their own. The midwives were just there in case. Okay? And so when they say the Israel women are too hardy, they have their babies before we can get there, might not have been a lie. That may have been actually the way it happened. Right? But either way, they're not killing no baby boys. Okay? And so then what does he do? Well, he enslaves them, and as they continue to grow in power, he says, every baby boy must die. Okay? So here's where we are now. Now Egypt has become a place of slavery for God's people. Okay? And not only a place of slavery, but they are now worshiping the gods of Egypt. Okay? And in their slavery, because there is no atheist in a foxhole, as they are enslaved, what do? They cry out to God. Oh yeah. Maybe we should think about that guy that used to take care of us. Where are you, God? Why have you stopped? Think about it. For 400 years, give or take, God has blessed them unbelievably. Okay? We will see them leave Egypt as one of the richest nations in the world at that moment, at that point. Their numbers have grown. We don't know exactly how many, but we get numbers in numbers that give us a sense, remembering that all the numbers in numbers are just men, not women and children. And so God has blessed them unbelievably, and what have they done largely? Forgot God. Why did Moses beat the Egyptian? Because Moses believed in God and the Egyptian didn't? No, Moses didn't know God. He just knew he was a Hebrew. So his response to the Egyptian is purely, what's the word? Genetic? Political? Right? And God has to introduce himself to him. He's going to learn about God as he spends those 40 years in the desert. Finally, God reveals himself to him in the burning bush. I think all that was in our reading this week. Yeah, okay. But what I want to show you with this is because I want to prepare you for the rest of Exodus, and as we also get into Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, is we are getting ready to now turn this thing backwards. God puts them in Egypt to save them. While they're in Egypt, they are saved, and they grow tremendously, but they also become enslaved. Enslaved to the Egyptians and enslaved to other gods. Okay? And now God is going to insert himself into their history. Not that he ever left it, but in a very powerful way, using Moses to break them out of the slavery, set up a new covenant with them on Mount Sinai, not new in that he's changing what he's promised to do, but he now brings them under a covenant with them so they understand their life as his people. And then he's going to take them finally up, first through the Red Sea, both times through the Red Sea and through the Jordan River, through water into his promised land. Okay? And I couldn't find quickly the thing to put it, but I want to explain to you how absolutely important this diagram is. Okay? Because it's going to happen 2 more times in history. God is going to take his people out of slavery in Babylon, back through the waters of the Jordan River, back into his promise. Okay? It's going to happen again for every single one of us, where God inserts himself into our slavery to sin, takes us through water, baptism, into a new covenant made by Jesus' death and resurrection, and finally, ultimately, into our promised land. This is exactly the picture of salvation, whether we're talking about saving God's people from Egypt, saving God's people from Babylon, or saving God's people from sin, death, and the power of the devil. This is exactly how he does it. Okay? And so I wanted you to see that as we go into it, right? How do we find Jesus in these things? Well, as we watch God rescue his people, right, take them out of Egypt, get them back to the promised land, what we know is God said, you're going to receive this land, and in this land is going to be born the Messiah. So all of this is nothing more and nothing less than God fulfilling his promise to send the Messiah through these people. Always, and we'll see it so many times in so many ways through the whole rest of the Old Testament, in spite of them. Okay? Including going to Babylon and coming back. Works in the same way. And then ultimately, after another 400-year break, isn't that convenient? Jesus comes and enters into, if you will, the exact same picture, but put your sin here, his cross and resurrection here, and heaven here, and you have a picture of your salvation. Right? How do the 10 Commandments start? No, 10 Commandments does not start with the first commandment. Believe it or not. It starts with, I, the Lord your God, have brought you out of Egypt. 10 Commandments are not now here's what you got to do to be my children. The 10 Commandments are, look at what I've done. Now, let's talk about how we live this out. All right, so we get into those first chapters of Exodus. Pharaoh's oppressing Israel. I love this. Some of the sharpen the focuses this week really struck me in the devotional Bible I'm using. It says, where is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob? The people of Israel must have wondered. The people of Egypt must have snickered. The Lord was where he has always been, doing what he's always done. Planning a way to deliver and encourage, save, and to cheer his people. He was preparing Israel to see and receive his deliverance. He was planning to use Israel one day as the cradle for Christ, our Savior from sin. even now, as we're working into Exodus, he is planning a way to deliver you from your situation. He wants to encourage and cheer you while you wait for his deliverance. Okay? So even as we think about Israel, the nation, finding themselves in slavery, ultimately, what does the slavery do? It drives them to their knees before God and says, we need you. We can't do this without you. Or they had forgotten that. So if you ever wonder why God sometimes lets things happen to you, I call it God's rug. He just grabs it and he yanks it. And what do? Fall on your knees or flat on your face and realize what?
He's in charge. He's in control.
You can't do this without him. Okay? It's interesting, we don't often think about it, but faith, and this kind of links with the sermon, so I won't preach the whole sermon since some of you haven't heard it. But faith ultimately is complete dependence on God. And if you watch what God has done in Genesis with Abraham, with Noah, with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, with Joseph, with the rest of the boys even, really, right? What does he keep doing? He keeps yanking the rug out from underneath him. Abraham, you're going to have a son. Oh, God must need some help. Nope. You're going to wait 25 years until you know you can't do it on your own. And then I'm going to do it for you. Right? Joseph had to learn faith. Complete dependence on God. For him to be ready to be who God needed him to be by the time we get to the people coming to Israel. The nation needs to fall on its knees before God, before God's ready for the next part of the plan of salvation. And it's going to happen over and over and over again. And as you read through the Old Testament and you see it, and therefore see all these ways in which God's fulfilling his promises, and even these beginning chapters of Exodus, see all the ways God is fulfilling his promises and how he does it, we can constantly be asking, why did he choose that? Because he did. But in a lot of cases, we can see where God is getting his people to the point of having to rely on him, removing their ability to rely on themselves anymore.
Okay. And even though we experience that over and over again, we're still brickheads.
We're stupid.
We're still, you know,
yeah.
think we're in charge.
Well, and ultimately, yeah, we do constantly remind ourselves how in charge we are, right? But that's actually what the first sin was, right? You can be in charge rather than letting God be in charge, right? And all we can do is ultimately feel so blessed and understand God's grace that he simply chooses to keep pulling that rug out from underneath us and forcing us to our knees. It isn't standing behind us with some kind of big club ready to bash our head in. Because that's exactly what we deserve. Right? It sounds terrible. God would never do that. Right? That's the point. He could. Right? Bill Cosby, to his kids, I brought you into this world. I can take you out again and make another one just like you. Right? And that's exactly what God could do. Good. Anything else in Exodus as we look at chapters? Chapter 3 is when we finally get to the burning bush, right? And notice the change in... Oh, sorry. Yes, ma'am. Who? Whatever.
Okay, because it's just...
Hey, stupid works too.
So, because it's just in the middle of all of this, and it's just, I have no idea why.
Okay.
Exodus 4:24.
Exodus 4:24.
At the lodging place in the way the Lord met him, Moses, and sought to put him to death.
Yeah.
Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched it to Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me."
So he let him alone.
Yeah.
So what's the problem here?
What? First of all, why would God say kill him? He was on his way to do what he
Because he refused to circumcise his sons. What is circumcision? The sign of the covenant that God made with Abraham. Moses has been brought into that covenant, but he refuses to circumcise, refuses, forgets, chooses not to, procrastinates, put whatever word you want, ain't good. Okay? And who has to do it? Mom does it to save her husband from God's wrath. Okay? Yes?
In Exodus 3.
Go back to 3. I'm glad you're all very, very happy with that answer. Because there's about 15 other ones we could give you. Joe's over there going, yeah, but what about, but he's being kind. Yes, chapter 3.
So it's chapter 3 where God is talking to Moses saying, hey, I'm just going to do this.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if there's any significance to this or if it's just interesting reading for some of us. In chapter 21, it says,
Verse 21.
and I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask her neighbor and any woman who lives in the house for silver and gold jewelry, and you shall put them on your sons and daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. So when I read that, I went, my definition of plunder is kind of, I think of it as like violently stealing, blah, blah, blah. It says here, hey ladies, go ask your neighbor, give them your stuff.
The plundering this time is not going to be the pillage and plunder that we normally think of. The plundering this time is going to be, here, take it, get out of here.
And the ladies get to do that.
Everybody gets to do that. I know the ladies will, but the guys will too, right? So here's the deal. I'm going to give my people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. How is that going to happen? Does that mean the Egyptians are going to love them so much that they're going to give them whatever they want? No. The favor they're going to have is they're going to be scared to death that the Israelites' gods are going to do something else. And they're going to give them everything that they can possibly load up on their wagons and put on their backs and get them out of here. Is that a fair way of putting it?
That's before the plagues.
Yes.
So they haven't.
No. God is saying this before the plagues.
Oh, it hasn't actually happened because I know they
Right.
plunder after too.
Well, no. Right. God is talking to Moses now at the burning bush. This is what's going to happen. Right? Notice the change in Moses. He goes from, I'm going to save the Hebrews myself, which he figures isn't going to work because he killed an Egyptian and there's a whole bunch more that he'd have to kill, to God saying, I'm going to use you to save my people. And he goes, who am I? He goes from Prince of Egypt, kind of over the law, kills a Hebrew, then realizes that was the bad thing to do, leaves, and now God has put him through it to the point where Moses has a very different opinion of himself than he had in Egypt. Yeah. Sorry, Paul.
Well, his father-in-law was, he was a worshiper of God.
Yeah.
Okay, so did Zipporah the insight to circumcise the boy and touch his feet? You know what I'm saying? I just kind of wondered about a lot of things.
Yes. Zipporah you know, Moses' father-in-law is the one who teaches him about God.
Don't you think that those, I give them 5 years, 3 to 5 years with Mama at the house, after the Egyptian princess said, take him, Miriam, that whole business, everybody, she worked it out so her mother.
Well, until he was weaned.
Yeah, until he's weaned, which is probably at that time about 3 years.
Maybe.
But don't you think that Mama would have had some I mean, they're the tribal.
Well, I'm sure Mama sang him the songs and told him the stories and everything, but if you take a 5-year-old and then give him 25 years of atheism in your household and teach you that you are next to God, son of Pharaoh, son of God, how much of that do you think he remembers from when he was 5 years old? Right? So, the clearest understanding of Scripture is Moses knows better and doesn't do it. Okay? Thanks be to God, he doesn't threaten us with killing us for not baptizing our kids on the 8th day. Okay? And we don't know how old the kids are now. But remember, how old is Moses as he heads back to Egypt? He's 80. He was 40 when he left Egypt. He's been gone for 40 years. Moses is 80. That picture, you know, of Moses, the stud, probably ain't true. And his boys may be close to 20 years old now. So it's not like his boys were twins born a couple months ago and he forgot. Okay? Yeah. No, first Paul. Oh, unless you're fixing what I just said.
No, I was just going to say the rabbis say these 3 verses are the hardest verses of the Pentateuch.
There you go. Did you hear that? Rabbis say that these 3 verses about God threatening to kill Moses and Zipporah stepping in and circumcising her sons are the hardest 3 verses in the whole Pentateuch to understand. So if the Jews can't understand it, we're toast. Yes?
Question on circumcision. That's so important that you gotta have it, you're baptized. And there's a lot of people in this world.
Remember, is it possible for somebody to go to heaven without being baptized? Yes. The issue comes when we refuse baptism. Now the question comes whether or not we are in the faith and therefore will be in heaven. Because God has said, I got this for you. This connects you to me. This gives you the promise of eternal life. And we say, I don't need that. That's where the problem comes in. Okay? Are there people who go to heaven who come to faith on their deathbed and never have a chance to be baptized? Are they going to heaven? Yes. The issue of not being baptized is the lack of faith in God to do in baptism what he promises to do. Better way to put that?
His question about circumcision.
Yes. So circumcision.
Christ's circumcision is our circumcision.
Right.
Circumcision was a connection to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus, his circumcision is our connection
to Abraham,
Isaac, and Jacob.
So yes, circumcision is that important in that world. Okay? In that world. Right? Our circumcision, as Joe's saying, our circumcision happens in Jesus Christ. And then baptism becomes the circumcision, if you will, of the New Testament people of God. Okay? And how does it work and who's going to heaven and who's not is really exactly the same. It's not the act itself. It's what God promises to do in the act. And the issue becomes when we simply choose not to, say we don't have to, don't believe in the promise, say we're good enough without it, however you want it. We had a young man in California. He was doing a wonderful job doing our youth ministry and teaching youth Sunday school every Sunday until we found out that he wasn't baptized. Never was. And when we confronted him, he said, so what? I believe. We spent some time teaching with him, and he said, nah, I don't need that. He wasn't teaching anymore. Because we couldn't even be sure he was in the faith anymore. Because he came right out and said, I don't need that. That's for kids. Kind of the opposite of Baptists. That's for adults. Sorry, whoever's watching. I shouldn't have said that. Okay. All right. Anything else quick? Yes?
So we can probably talk about this next week, because I know
No, we can talk about it in 2 weeks, because I won't be here.
Okay, yeah, but the fact that God says, go do this, but I'm going to harden his heart, so he's not going to let my people go. I've always wondered why.
So hardening of the heart is an interesting thing. It's one of those difficult things to understand. How it was explained to me, at least several of my professors, helping us understand what hardening the heart is, right? Hardening of the heart is something a person does to themselves. Okay? They refuse to believe. And then at some point, God confirms them in that. Okay? Because they're not going to come to faith. Now, when does that happen? I don't know. But there are some in the Bible, Pharaoh is one of them, that God says, listen, I'm going to give them every reason in the world to believe in me. But he won't. I'm confirming him in his disbelief. Okay? Why God chooses some of those people to do that ahead of time? Thanks be to God, he doesn't do it to us. Right? But that's, I think, the best we can do with hardening heart, because it puts it on God, so God's doing something, right? But God never discards anyone. So God's hardening of somebody's heart is a result of their complete rejection of him that will never be turned around. Okay?
Yeah, God only hardens hard hearts. He doesn't harden
Right.
soft hearts.
Yeah, so it says God's doing it, he's just confirming. It's kind of like when people come to me and they say, Pastor, we're going to get a divorce, fix us. And I kind of go, hate to tell you, the divorce kind of has already happened. The piece of paper just confirms it. So this is God hardening somebody's heart is just God confirming what that person has already done to themselves in their rejection of him. I like that. God only hardens hard hearts. Okay. All right, I'm preaching today, so I'm not in a hurry. So next week I won't be here. You'll have a visitor for part of the Bible study hour from Family Promise. And then, as far as I know, Pastor Berlinski is going to occupy your time. So don't hesitate to come with questions. And if Pastor Berlinski's not here, ta-da! So if you're reading something, and don't hesitate to keep track of those questions, I'll be back in 2 weeks. And if we have to cover 2 weeks in that time, we can do that. Exodus is full of repeating narratives. God saves his people. They act like idiots. God does it again, they act like idiots. God does it again, they act like idiots. Moses says, why did you give me these people? God comes Moses, and they act like idiots. It just keeps happening over and over again.
For the rest of the Old Testament.
Well, for the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Yes, ma'am.
Our teachers are waiting for parents to pick up kids.
Let's pray. Parents, you can leave while you're praying. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Steve, I see you're starting Reformation Month off right.
Tables go up.
Tables go up. Always and forever.
Love check, cards,
Yeah.
deposit, sending to the church.